Mm-hmm. 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 Grandma's hand clapped in church on Sunday morning. Grandma's hands played a tambourine so well. Grandma's hands used to issue out a warning. She'd say, Billy, don't you run so fast. Might fall on a piece of glass. Might be snakes there in that grass. Grandma's hand.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about my grandmother's hands, and this video is to help to guide you, and it has two purposes. One is to think about what are some best practices for facilitating a book club at your center. So when we think about what this looks like, many of us have been engaged in book clubs in different ways, but maybe have not necessarily facilitated one and don't necessarily know what best practices are. So we're going to outline some best practices, and then we're going to provide some methods, some specific methods for utilizing My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem at your center or site. So as we go forward, I want to share a few things. So again, we want to talk about some book club best practices. So number one is to establish a schedule. As you're thinking about getting prepared, you want to think about what are our regular meeting times going to be, and think about how you can ensure consistencies and provide that to that information to members so that they can plan and commit to doing so accordingly. Number two is to have discussion guidelines. So in some places, you may or may not know that people have already thought about what are our discussion guidelines that we're going to engage with. So you may consider some agreements. Think about some of the agreements that you've received through some of the coaching sessions that you've had throughout our time together. And think about using maybe some of those community agreements to think about how will we have these discussions to make sure they're respectful, inclusive, and also focused. Now, number three is to have a reading outline. So you want to give people who are going to be members of the book club reading outlines for each session in advance. This helps people to make sure that we're on the same page, literally, when we're coming in for discussions. So in a way, that helps for people to prevent spoilers for people who might not have read the book before. And it also makes sure that people have time to digest the material in advance. Remember, when we're talking about having inclusive spaces, we want to make sure people have the time that they need to be able to process before discussing. So when we come in to discuss, we want to think about facilitating and making sure that there's some engagement, encouraging everyone who's involved to share their insights, ask questions. And also what we've learned is that when people can relate the material to their own experiences, that we know that that changes the dynamics and makes it a lot more engaging. For number five, promoting accountability. So we think about how you might assign different roles to different people in the group. So who might be the discussion leader, or someone to take notes to share afterwards, or even someone to keep time so that you stay on track and on schedule. And think about how you might rotate those responsibilities to keep everyone engaged. If I know you, and I think I know many of you pretty well, we know that we take our commitment and integrity pretty seriously. So when we have a role to play, we're more likely to maintain our accountability. So number six, while we want to make sure we promote accountability, we also want to provide flexibility. So we know that we're all very busy and we may not be able to attend every meeting or read every book or every chapter, but we want to be flexible so that people feel welcome to still participate. Number seven, we want to think about how can we create the safest space possible, right? So when we think about how do we create an environment where people who are a part of this book club can feel comfortable, and even if they're not comfortable, at least safe, expressing their opinions and thoughts, especially when we're discussing sensitive topics. So again, these are guidelines that you can use when thinking about any book that you might want to offer as a book club offering at your center. And then number 8 is action and application. So as you are going through any book, while books are great to read for many different reasons, when you're doing this at work, we want to think about how these things can be applied to the workplace and help members to share what their action plans are going to be for implementing new ideas or strategies that they learn. And then number 9 is to seek feedback. Regularly solicit feedback from members to assess how effective you're being and then make adjustments as needed. So remember, you're seeking feedback. You want to make sure those things are incorporated because people want to know. Now, that is just some best practices for book clubs. What we're offering you is also some specific outlines, and I'm going to go through them, and you can also access this in a Word format version that can also be pretty helpful for you. So some example outlines that we have is thinking about taking the sessions and bringing some broad topics. So if you're using a broad topic outline, and these 2 examples that we're providing are thinking about it through 5 sessions. We're thinking about 5 sessions because that allows people enough time to commit, but it also is not too long for people to feel afraid to commit too much. So if you're using this outline and you're focusing on these broad topics, in session 1, you might just focus on setting the foundation. And what you'll notice in each of these sessions is that it gives pages to read, right? So chapters that people would read prior to the session, then talk about what the discussion focus is going to be and how you might focus your time in that moment. And then we also are including a practical application. So for session 1, when you set the foundation, that is looking at the introduction and up to chapter 6. So you're introducing the concept of intergenerational trauma and how that can impact individuals and individuals. And you're also going to start exploring the role of the body in processing and healing trauma. So you think about that lens, and then in this practical application, you're going to practice some grounding exercises. Now, in session 1, you want to make sure that those techniques that you're using are things that are lower risk, right? So maybe having a guided meditation or breathing exercise, something that people can feel safe enough to do in a group with other people. In session 2, the way we've outlined it is to think about then focusing on exploring racialized trauma. In this section, you're thinking about focusing on chapters 7 through 12. And the focus during this time could be examining the ways in which racialized trauma affects people of color and white people differently. What you might think about focusing on is discussing the role of shame, guilt, and denial and how that perpetuates racial trauma. For this practical application, you want to continue to think about also continue to using these grounding exercises, but increasing that engagement of somatic awareness exercises that are found in the book and using some reflective writing prompts maybe to explore people's personal experiences. So you'll notice that as we move forward, we're going to kind of increase the stakes of how uncomfortable some of the exercises might be for application. Now, session 3 centers on strategies for healing and reconciliation. And that will focus on reading chapters 13 to 18. And during this session, you might focus the discussion on strategies for healing racialized trauma and promoting reconciliation, thinking about the importance of empathy, compassion, and accountability and how they play in the healing process. Now, in this session, this is session 3. So you've had 2 sessions to be together. And now might be a time to apply it by sharing personal stories of resilience and healing, and also practicing some self-compassion exercises. Again, you want to use the exercises that are in the book that can support you all in applying these things. Because remember, people will be able to read them in the book, but it might take and relieve some of the fear of using some of the skills if you do it collectively. Now, session 4, when using this outline, will be focusing on applying embodied racial justice. So we're talking about what justice looks like and exploring the concept of racial justice in an embodied way and the implications that can come up for personal and societal transformation. Discussing some practical steps for promoting racial justice and reconciliation in everyday life might be another one of the discussion focus areas. And for practical application in this session, you all can work together to brainstorm some action items. How can we create a more inclusive and healing-centered space? Now, you'll be able to bring in things from the book and also some of the things you've learned from the trauma and healing center coaching and support that you've been receiving for the past few years. And commitment is a big part of that session. Now, for session 5, which will be the last session, if you use this outline, will be for reflection and integration. So you're wrapping the book up reading chapters 23 to 24, the conclusion, and focusing on the reflective exercises in the book. And in this time, you might think about focusing on key takeaways from the book and key takeaways from the discussions you had in the previous weeks. So you would talk about maybe possibly sharing experiences from applying, like what does it look like over this time together? And then with practical application, complete a reflective exercise in the book, either individually or in small groups, and then share what that has felt like. So again, this might be one option that you could use if you use this outline. Now, one other way, instead of using these broad topics, is to actually use the topics in the book and follow the topics in the book in a very specific way. And in this way, we would think about what the readings are, discussion topics, and some activities to do in each one. And then what you'll notice is that it also talks about how to connect it to workforce development. Right? So when we think about using this outline in week 1, you might think about introduction and recognizing white body supremacy. Again, this follows more the flow of the book. It will be specific about what is happening in those chapters instead of the broader topics that I just shared. So with this model, you might use some discussion topics about the book's main concepts in the introduction, understanding white body supremacy, historical context, and recognizing how it manifests in everyday life. So some activities might be to do some group introductions, sharing personal motivations for joining this book club, using some reflective journaling on initial reactions to the concept of white body supremacy, and then maybe have a small group discussion on those personal experiences and observations. And then in this connection, you're asking, how does white body supremacy show up in workplace environments and in our personal interactions, in personal and professional interactions? Now, then in week 2 and week 3, that will go into pain and trauma, and then racial constructs and implicit bias. So again, you'll see the same outline going with these discussion topics, exploring the concept and the role, and using these activities like using some guided meditation, sharing in the group, and then connecting it to workforce development. One of the things that is different in week 3 in racial constructs in the activities is thinking about encouraging people to take the implicit bias association test through Harvard or other exercises to uncover your own personal biases. You might also think about role-playing scenarios or how to practice recognizing and addressing biases as they occur. You might also think about what types of training programs need to happen to reduce those implicit biases and promote inclusivity in the workplace. If you use this model, week 4 is police and policing. Again, you'll see these same things, these activities, brainstorming. You might analyze a case study as an activity. And this still goes through chapter 16 to 20. And then week 5 goes into the integration and application. And the activities that you'll see there is final reflective journaling on the overall impact of the book, some group sharing. And then in this session, you might plan for follow-up meetings or continued study on related topics. Maybe it's about planning for a new book. And in this one, you would create a collective action plan to promote racial equity and support trauma-informed practices in the workplace. In this session, you might identify resources you already have or new resources and networks that can help you continue to grow. So as you see, we have these 2 different outlines, and each one has some specific topics, some activities, and some prompts on how to connect it to the workforce development. Now, some people ask, well, what can I do every session? So for every session, if you want to have just a outline, this is a trauma-informed practice. You can just have some transparency where sessions might have a similar cadence of every time we're going to start with a grounding. And remember, you might start with the first one with a lower level of risk and that grounding exercise, and then increasing it to where it's using some more of the intentional ones in the book and others that people bring in. You might then continue with using the discussion prompt, and you might use a round robin style where everyone has an option to answer or respond and go around in a circle where everyone has the opportunity to pass, but everyone also has the opportunity to share. Then you might say, okay, now we're going to pose a question. And maybe you do that in round robin, or maybe you take a moment and say, two people pair and share, and then bring things back to the group of things that came up for them. And then go into a personal reflection. How will people center healing and how does it connect to workforce development? Then do a wrap up and talk about what the action step is for next time. And then close out with a collective grounding exercise.